Good evening to you all, and thank you very much for coming along this evening and allowing me to share a medieval treasure with you. I must say that I read history at university, and my favorite was 1066 and all that. So I really enjoy medieval history. And I must say, listening to Tom, I have the feeling that, in 100 or 150 years' time, I will be one of those forgotten women of Jewish history too, because that seems to happen to women, that they get forgotten very quickly, and their role in moving things forward is forgotten. I gave a talk earlier about Lily Montagu today, and very much that's what happened to her, that she got forgotten for a long time. Rabbi Regina Jonas, she got forgotten for a long time. And I suspect that will happen to me too, and that's all right. But anyway, I was doing a series on women in Judaism and looking through different sorts of lists and trying to give a variety to my congregation. And I came across a Licoricia. I think anyone out there who knows better than me, you can correct me later, but I think it's Licoricia, maybe with a lisp to it, if you want to be, Catalan or something. But I think it's that, and it's obviously to do with licorice, because apparently they use the names of sweetmeats for their girls in some of the Spanish medieval communities. So it's really licorice of Winchester. And if you think of that, and I love licorice, so that's good. So I'm going to try and share a PowerPoint with you. And always apologies if things go wrong. We were talking before about how funny it is that all us rabbis have had to desperately get in touch with the 21st century and how to use all this strange, all these strange programs that we had never heard of before. So this, of course, obviously is a statue made in real life of Licoricia of Winchester, actually done about 2 years ago, something like that. Looking at medieval pictures of women and trying to come up with a statue that would do for the occasion, and that has gone up now in Winchester, marking this incredible woman and what she achieved. Doing a little bit of the background, I'm sure many of you recognize this. It's the Bayeux tapestry. During the Norman conquest, and this was William the Conqueror, there he is, says William at the back there. He invited the Jewish community from his native Normandy to come over to this country to encourage trade. They originally settled in London, but by 1159, they had formed 9 communities which were self-governing in Jewish matters. One of these was in Winchester. Most historians estimate that the Jewish population in Britain peaked at around 5,000 people in the year 1200, compared to a population at that time that was about 4 to 5 million. This is, of course, just the battle of them coming out of William the Conqueror and the Normans fighting. The Jews came over to Britain in an impossible and a precarious situation. They were restricted to the trades they could carry out in this country. They were not allowed to own land for long enough to make it worthwhile, for example, but they were merchants in wine, wheat, wool, and craftsmen in gold and silver and leather much sought after as doctors and midwives and scribes and agents, and of course they were money lenders. Why money lenders? Because money lending was regarded as a sin by the church, and Christians were forbidden to engage in it by the Pope, though in practice you must know that the Jewish community never had a monopoly on lending. Many of the church organizations sustain themselves through the practice. But Jews with their community connections could provide money in different locations without having to transport it, which was obviously very difficult. There was no paper money. And of course, it was very dangerous to transport stuff because it could get stolen on the way. Whereas the Jewish community could write a letter to an agent in another country and ask them to provide money to somebody when they got there, and that worked. And the Jewish community shared the task across Europe. And their innovative products, such as mortgages and futures, were able to provide funding for building castles, cathedrals, and abbeys on an unprecedented scale. There were rules governing their lending activities, such as the restriction on the amount of interest they could charge and how long they could hold land for one that was called in for an unpaid debt. One estimate puts the proportion of the Jewish population working at the highest level of financial dealing at about 1% of the population, of the Jewish population, but it seems highly probable that many others were lending smaller amounts of money to their poorer Christian neighbors. The Jewish community provided an important source of funds for the kings, and in return were granted protection in the royal castles and other sanctuaries whenever they were threatened. The price for protection was substantial. They were regularly and heavily and unpredictably taxed, and the king took a proportion of their estates, generally a third, but it could be all of it, on their death. In this way, they provided a private income for certainly the kings in England and their relatives. Because of this, anyone harming a Jew was answerable directly to the king, giving rise to the term the king's Jews. Yes. Winchester was important in this regard because in early medieval times, the royal mint and treasury was based there. King Henry III was born in Winchester Castle in 1207 and spent much of his time in the city. In January 1252, King Henry III sent a writ, which was a written command, to the Sheriff of Hampshire to investigate the theft from the synagogue of an apple of Eve by Cressy of Stamford, a Jew. It's thought that the apple of Eve was an etrog. That the king was personally involved in this case testifies to the importance of Winchester's Jewish community. Winchester has an important and fascinating Jewish past. The earliest record of Jews in the city dates back to the mid-1100s, making it one of the earliest Jewish settlements in England. A record from 1148 shows only 2 Jewish families in Winchester. The first evidence for a Jewish presence is the payment of a fine by Gentil, the Jewess of £15 in order for her not to have to marry. So this poor Jewish woman had to pay £15, which is an absolute fortune, to the king. And this is an effigy, of course, of the king, of King Henry III, so that she didn't have to marry. She'd been widowed and she didn't want to marry again, but she had to pay a fine in order to do that. Medieval Winchester was well located on trade routes and had a royal castle. It was a prosperous city with a wide variety of trades. It housed one of the great fairs of England, the St. Giles Fair, which brought Jewish and Christian traders to the city. From the late 12th century, all Jewish activities this is the castle, the ruins of the castle. But from the late 12th century, all Jewish activities had to be recorded in chests, such as this one, known as archive, like the word archives, of course. So Jews began to gather in those towns that had the chests. Winchester was one of these cities, and eventually it became a center for Jewish administrative matters in the county. The Jewish community often clustered in particular neighborhoods. And you can see here the streets that were known where Jews had territory, yes? And this is, of course, the synagogue. This is the county jail. It's all near the castle, which was an important place for the protection of the Jewish people. And the cemetery was just outside the area. They largely dwelt in a place which eventually, after the medieval period actually, became known as Jewry Street. None of the houses, as it says here, from the early period still survive, and it was known as Shoemaker Street or Shorten Street at the time, when Licoricia seems to have lived there for a while. They lived alongside their Christian neighbors, and it has been suggested that there were exceptionally good relationships between the two communities, although Winchester Jews faced accusations of killing Christian children for their blood as part of Jewish rituals and I haven't got a picture from Winchester, I'm afraid, but it's the nearest I could get, in 1192, 1225, 1232, and 1244. For example, in 1232, a one-year-old boy was found dead near St. Swithin's Priory. His body had been dismembered and mutilated. The mother had fled the city, but suspicion fell on Abraham Pinch, who was accused of buying the child from his nursemaid and carrying out a dreadful ritual that mocked the crucifixion of Jesus. The whole Jewish community was imprisoned in Winchester Castle for their safety until the person who committed the murderous act was discovered. Eventually, the baby's mother was found guilty, but the Jewish community was only allowed to leave the castle after, guess what? They'd paid a fine. However, the citizens of Winchester were not happy with the verdict, and resentment brewed for years. In 1236, 4 years later, the townspeople accused Abraham Pinch of having stolen 2 shillings from a local shop. He was found guilty and hanged in Jewry Street outside the city jail, which was opposite his property. He was buried beneath the gallows, and it's believed his body is still there. By the mid-1200s, the total population of Winchester was around 8,000, but the number of Jews was at just about 90. And that included very wealthy Jews and poor Jews. All the Jews in the land were under the custody of the king. They were allowed to trade, practice their religion, but had, of course, these large taxes or tallages to the king for living, working, and worshipping. And any Jew over the age of 12 had to pay 7 shillings annually to remain in the country. The money was used to support Jewish converts to Christianity. The Lateran Council of 1215 declared that Jews need to be distinguished from Christians by their dress, but it seems that it was not mandatory in England until 1267 that there was a Jewish hat, but it's not clear exactly under what circumstances English Jews were required to wear such hats, and even if required, whether they actually did so. These frescoes from Winchester Cathedral are believed to date from around 1160. And look, he's wearing the so-called Jewish hat. Is that amazing? It seems that the idea of a Jewish hat was established well before the Lateran Council. It was not until 1218 that King Henry III proclaimed the Edict of the Badge, which required Jews to wear a badge. But it's not clear how effective the edict was, since in 1253 it was again required that Jews aged 7 years old and older should wear a badge made of yellow felt, 6 by 3 inches, in the shape of the 2 tablets given on Mount Sinai. In Winchester, for a while at least, you could pay, guess what? A fine not to wear your badge. You can see where the money comes from. Now, what's fascinating is look at this picture. Yes, it's from the Winchester Bible, thought to be done in 1160. This is the page about the book of Samuel, who's here obviously pouring oil on Saul's head. Now, in most of the Bibles which are illustrated, there is no great Jewish connection given in the drawings. But look at this drawing. Can you see just there? There's a guy in a Jewish hat. Yeah? Can you see it? Is it big enough? Yes, good. So, some communities were able to pay money not to wear the Jewish marker. And for a while, Winchester certainly was, oh, sorry, it's a bit hazy, that picture. I don't know quite how to make it clearer. It was also home to some of the largest and wealthiest Jews. Oh yes, this is a blow up of that picture, of course, and that's why it's a bit hazy. There it is, there's the hat. It was home to Licoricia, as I said earlier. They would conduct their meetings in Winchester's Great Hall, and the Great Hall still exists today. So we can see where Licoricia went. Isn't that gorgeous? I love this big shield there at the end. It reminds me of one in various other halls I've seen from that period. Yes, and you can imagine the Jews going in there and conducting their business. Now, Licoricia herself was the daughter of Isaac and the most notable English Jewish woman of her time. She was born sometime towards the beginning of the 13th century. The fact we don't know the date of her birth is quite common when one looks at all medieval people. So it's not just her that we don't know the date of her birth. She was married twice. After the death of her first husband, Abraham, who was the son of Isaac of Kent and Winchester, Licoricia continued to live in Winchester with her 3 sons, one who was called Cockerell, probably Isaac, Benedict, Baruch, of course, and Lombard. And don't ask me what the Hebrew name for that is, because I don't know. By 1234, she had enough money and business acumen to be operating a money lending business in her own right. And records show that she lent money in association with other Jews, as well as by herself with an attorney. Initially, Licoricia's clients were landowners and minor gentry. Her first recorded loan was for a sum of £10, a rather large sum, as this was sufficient to pay for a new, fully fitted ship. Yeah, that's a huge amount of money. By the end of the decade, she was one of the richest Jewish moneylenders in Winchester. Now, I couldn't find a document with her signature on it, I'm sorry, but it's an example of the sort of document that was drawn up between the parties at this period. She is referred to as Licoricia of Winchester because Winchester was her main place of business. Jewish businesswomen in that period were not unusual, and Winchester boasted a number of them at the time. As many as 10% of the loans recorded in the English King's rolls of the time were made by Jewish women. And this, of course, again, is not one from her, but remember, you know, when we talk about a covenant, we talk about a covenant in Hebrew being cut. You cut a covenant. Why? Because in ancient times, what you did is you had 2 pieces of stick that you broke, and then you put it together to prove it was all part of the same agreement, or eventually a document which would be cut or torn in a particular sort of random pattern. And then each party to the agreement would have their own piece of parchment which fitted together, and in a society where most could not read, that was proof, of course, that the documents belonged together and that an agreement had been made. Often Jewish women throughout the ages have been sole supporters of their households. Think of the last book of Proverbs of the woman of worth. She looked after a household, but also ran business activities. And of course, they are still in ultra-Orthodox families today, many, many women who are the main breadwinners for the family, enabling men to study and pray. Unlike the ladies, this is another of the documents here, again, not hers, but it gives you an idea of what was going on there. Unlike the ladies of the Norman ruling class, who under English common law had no legal status apart from their husbands, even married Jewish women conducted business and could represent themselves in court. A Jewish bride received a dowry, which often, not always, but often remained under her personal control and may have constituted seed money for starting a business. And there is a Jewish lead token, which was found in excavations in Brook Street in Winchester. No one's quite sure exactly what this was for, but it has some Hebrew on it that nobody can read because it's not clear enough. So they're not sure whether it was money that was used within the community or money or a coin that you used to pay for a community service, or money that or a token that was used to sort of symbolized some sort of legal enactment of money that had happened. But it was Jewish, and it was a lead token pointing to the community there in Winchester. Notable female lenders were Abigail of London, Hera of Winchester, Mirabell of Gloucester, Belasset of Bristol, Comitissa of Cambridge, and our own Licoricia of Winchester. But she was really the most successful and glamorous female leader of her time, so we're taught. Now, what they would have done in order to fulfill their business is they would have traveled widely around the country on horseback, and we know that she did it on horseback too, but I found this in a document, a coach, this was a man, of course, inside, but they would have gone around richly clothed, accompanied by armed guards, lending money to all individuals in all strata of society, bankrolling illustrious nobles like the king's brother-in-law, Simon de Montfort, whom you may have heard about. He led a rebellion which ended in his death. But she also did small financing for farmers and lesser barons. She did some pawnbroking and even lent household money to local women, local Gentile women. Education of Jewish women was encouraged. Licoricia would have been able to speak several languages, at least Norman, French, Latin, vernacular English, and it is presumed, but not known, possibly some Hebrew. She would have learnt the trade, of course, from her family. She was a formidable advocate in court, and she had a stone house on a large plot of land that was around an acre near Jewry Street. Her second marriage in 1242 was to one of the wealthiest Jews in England at the time, called David of Oxford. Again, this is, I'm afraid, a caricature from Christian documents with the gorgeous nose and a Jewish hat, and of course a bag of money. But it seemed to illustrate David of Oxford in some ways. In order to marry Licoricia, David had to divorce his first wife, Muriel. So you've got this strange thing. He had a wife called Muriel. And of course, divorce was not allowed, was it, in England at that time under Catholicism. There was a complex legal battle involving, it's another idea of a Jewish merchant there, involving David, Muriel, and her supporters, an English bet-in, the Paris bet-in, and King Henry III of England, and the Archbishop of York, Walter de Grey. This is an example of an English house, the Oxford Stone House, no longer existing still, but an idea of what that house would have looked like. And she would have lived like this in Winchester, and consider most of the houses in the town would have been of wood and wattle. So she was very wealthy, extremely wealthy. And this is a picture, an image of Walter de Grey, who was involved in all these complicated negotiations regarding the marriage. We can only speculate whether Licoricia and David were actually a love match or a practical gambit by two seasoned entrepreneurs. After the divorce, Licoricia married David, and she settled in Oxford, where she gave birth to their son Asher who was also called Sweet Man. There she assisted David in his business dealings. Sadly, the marriage only lasted 2 years because David died in 1244, leaving Licoricia with their new son Asher. When David had died, all the chests across the country that contained the official records of debts that were owed to him were sealed and taken to the Jewish exchequer for assessment. In order to prevent any interference, Licoricia was immediately imprisoned in the Tower of London until the process was completed. The price of her repurchase of all the debts owed to David was set at 5,000 marks, of which 4,000 went, this is again in the Tower of London, of which 4,000 went to a special exchequer established at Westminster Abbey for the building of a temple to house a new shrine to Edward the Confessor. Eventually, that's the new shrine, or at least where it is now, not quite as it was in those days. She was released in 1244 in September, so she spent about 7 months imprisoned in the Tower of London as a widow. She went back to live in Winchester. David's first wife, Muriel, as part of the divorce settlement, received a house just round the corner from David's home in Oxford. And maybe it was too awkward to stay living in Oxford, so she went off to Winchester. Now, she continued dealing with David's business enterprises and started new ones of her own. She frequented King Henry's court whenever he was in Winchester, dealing with his entourage as well as with the king. And the king aided her in some of her more questionable activities. In the 13th century, even a female financier had to be ruthless, astute, and unscrupulous. And Licoricia was no exception. She was involved in many disputes and allegations of shady dealings. The most well-known one was with Thomas of Chalcot Park in Stratford-on-Avon. I could have given you a picture of his house, but that was built in the 17th, 18th century. So I thought just the park will do here. He sued Licoricia in 1253, accusing the financier of charging excessive interest on a loan to his by then deceased father, forcing the elder to default, foreclosing on his estate, and forging documents. She was probably guilty of at least one of those allegations, but Licoricia parried by accusing Thomas of murdering his father and forging the deed. The king came to her defense. After all, it was in his own interests and in the interests of his royal income. While Chalcot ultimately won the case, we can hardly doubt that the king's favor helped to ensure that Licoricia got off all charges with only a small fine. Her ease of access to the king's court helped the Jewish community. She interceded with people who got into problems. So Belier of Bedford, a money lender who had been a partner of hers in a deal, sent Licoricia a precious gold ring as a gift to the king. The ring was mislaid, and Iveta, a neighbor, accused Licoricia of stealing it. Licoricia again was sent to the tower while the accusation was investigated. She was released when Iveta herself was found to be the thief, but she had to pay a fine again. And she paid a huge fine for David's chattels. In order to engage in the substantial and widespread business, she had to pay the fine, but she then was working as an active moneylender for another 30 years. She lent money to everybody, everywhere. And the disputes that she had in these business matters appear regularly in the calendar of the rolls of the Jewish Exchequer and other official records. Her lifestyle, her lifestyle was quite amazing. Again, pictures of Jews in the Jewish Exchequer. So these are Christians who are drawing Jews with their Jew hats on. They mostly lived in Jewish in areas that were close together, called the Jewry, and giving protection to each other. They used their homes for community synagogues, and as finance was conducted in kohen, which had to be locked up and guarded, a successful money lender's home would usually feature a cellar fortified against thieves and marauders. This is a little bit of how her family was connected to each other. You can see she has her first marriage to Abraham, and the important guy who carried on money lending after her death was Benedict. And Licoricia was married to David, who'd been married to Muriel. They had the sweet man, or the duke man, don't know how to pronounce, but again, it means sweet man. And he was only 2 when his father died. So he was not, so involved in all this stuff. We're told that her son Lombard was a ne'er-do-well. We don't know much about him, but it seems that he drifted from bad debts to petty crime before disappearing in the records. Asher eventually, in his 20s, 20 years after his father's death, became a financier and did very well, and he acted as Licoricia's agent in some matters. Now, the ending of her life was really quite strange and very sad. What we know is that in 1277, Belia, that's her there, Licoricia's daughter, found the bodies of Licoricia and Alice of Bicton, her Christian maid, stabbed to death in their home in Winchester, possibly murdered during a robbery. Locks had been broken off coffers and strong boxes, and goods were missing. Apparently, the crime was motivated by greed. The amount of money stolen was rumored to be the unlikely sum of £10,000. If you think it just cost 10 quid to furnish a boat, imagine £10,000 in those days. The authorities were concerned more with the theft of her property before it could be assessed than with the murder. Because don't forget, when Jews died, their property was assessed for taxes. Several men were accused of the theft, and a poor saddler who had fled the city was named as the murder suspect by the local tribunal, but there is no record of anyone ever standing trial. She's probably buried in the Jewish cemetery in Winchester. It was after her death that we see the gradual decline of the Jewish life in England. There were many reasons why relationships with the Jews deteriorated in the last half of the 13th century. First of all, Jews had been taxed so heavily, they were less and less useful to the crown, and there was mounting competition in money lending from Christians and from abroad. And they were unpopular with the barons, and increasingly the parliament was more important with the king and regarding access to his money. Now you can see the growth of their lack of popularity in the sort of manuscripts that appear, this is from Europe, in the late 13th century, early 14th century. You've got a devil here in the middle of the Jews. The Jews were really devils in disguise. And this one had lost his disguise, obviously. The poor monk is being obviously maltreated by this Jew in the Jew hat. And there's the money. Yeah? You can see how they became unpopular. They were also accused of all sorts of things. So again, the devil notion is here. Can you see here the stone? Oops, sorry. Can I go back? No, hang on. You can see here the tablet of stone badge that Jews were forced to wear. Yes. They were accused of money clipping, coin clipping. These are some examples of how they were clipped. You can see the clippings here and the coins from this period missing the edges. Because of course it was the weight of the coin that gave you the money. So you clip the coins, you melted them down, and then you made new coins. Now, there's no evidence to suggest that Jews were engaged in coin clipping any more than any of their Christian neighbors. In fact, as money lenders, it was not in their interest to do so because it could affect the money they were given. It meant it was less, it was not valuable as much as they hoped it had been. But they were 10 times more likely to be accused of it. Harry of Winchester was in fact a convert to Christianity, and he said that the Jews are totally involved in this trade, and he reported this to the king, and Harry went round to King Henry and named many Jews who were involved in coin clipping, and in 1279, 269 Jews and 29 Christians were executed for the offense. It became increasingly difficult for Jews to make any money out of lending money for interest. And as they couldn't farm, they risked starvation. In 1265, there was a siege of Winchester led by Simon de Montfort the Younger that resulted in the murder of many, many Jews in the city. This is a part of the battle that they had, a picture of the battle. Jews saw their businesses raided and destroyed, the beginning of the end. In 1290, with a new king as well, the church promised King Edward an enormous sum of money if he got rid of the Jews. He took the money and expelled the Jews. When finally ordered to leave England on the pain of death, Jews were allowed to take with them some cash and some personal property. But of course, all their debts were cancelled, and the crown seized their real estate, the cemeteries and the synagogues. This is an imagined reconstruction of a statue which would have represented Judaism in Winchester Cathedral. It was destroyed during the Cromwellian period. But, you know, the Jew is represented as a lovely girl, but look, she's got a blindfold on. There's the 10 Commandments. She is blindfold because she doesn't see the truth of Christianity. This is again from France, but it represents the horrific savagery with which Jewish homes were ransacked as the Jews were leaving, and stuff was pinched from the Jewish homes. A picture of from British sources of the Jews, this time wearing round gold badges, being ordered out by the king. And there it is, from a 13th century English manuscript, Jews being beaten by a Christian, and you can see they're wearing the Jewish badge, identifying them as Jews. And of course, that's where that picture comes from, by the way, to show you the whole book. It was just a little picture at the bottom. And they were thrown into boats, crowded boats. Some of the boats we know didn't deliver the Jews all the way to the continent. It was much more financially beneficial to throw out your Jewish passengers on the way and then go back and get more. You can see the Jewish hat there. And there were a lot of expulsions this sort of period, beginning 1100. There's 1290, and from Wales, 1290. And we were not allowed back into England, of course, until the period of Cromwell. And the Winchester Jewish Trail raised money for this beautiful statue of Licoricia of Winchester to put her on the map. Oh, I took too long, sorry. But have you got questions? If you put them in chat, I think that's the way Tom was hoping it would go. Yes? Tom, how do you want to deal with this? Unmute, I cry.
So I was trying to unmute me and then someone else popped in with the hand up. Yeah, if people want to put their hands up and I'll unmute them and they can ask questions, I think that makes sense. I'm going to bring in Michael Alam now for a question.
Yes, thank you very much for the informative talk. Thank you, Rabbi. I wanted to ask the laws that were made in medieval England concerning Jewish presence in England. Did those laws apply in Scotland at all?
I have no idea, I'm afraid. I mean,
I'm just interested. I just thought about it because I wondered if Scotland possibly emulated.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know because, of course, it was an independent country.
I know, but well, we all know. But
from your accent,
I'm just wondering if you know, with the relationship between England and Scotland, you know, one of compromise many times. You know, it's something I may have to look into myself. You know,
I'm sure that some of the rules applied in Scotland because the church, which was a transnational organisation, had instituted many of the rules. So the church in Scotland, if it had the power, would have brought the same rules in as they brought into England. So the business of wearing Jewish badges and things would have been as applicable in Scotland as here. But know that there was even much of a Jewish presence.
Well, that's true. That's true. Yeah, that's
You know,
true. I mean,
I'm not sure they got that far. I mean, the weather up there was too bad.
Yeah. Still, yeah, it's getting better.
So I'm not sure there was a Jewish presence. I haven't heard of a Jewish presence.
No, I think the first official Jewish presence was I think around about the 1700s. But I've often wondered if an unofficial presence must have been possible. May have been possible.
Listen, Jewish people get all over the place, but it wasn't a proper community, so I doubt whether they had a proper set of rules going.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Thanks. Thanks for.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? So I'm not very good at reading chat, so.
So Jackie, we have a comment in the chat about there being loans made to Scottish nobles and churchmen by English Jews, but no record of Jewish residents.
Aha, that makes sense. Yes, there wasn't a Jewish presence up there, but they lent the money anyway. Makes sense. I know that Licoricia didn't get that far, which is the woman I was most interested in. Anything else?
Okay, well,
I think Michael's got his hand up.
Oh,
sorry, I can't see a hand up. Where's a?
Michael with Alice and Michael, they can't. It's the physical hand.
Oh, sorry, it's physical hand. Sorry, I do apologise. Right, let me bring you in, Alice.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Jackie, was Licoricia involved in any early aspects of the enclosures, which most people think are much, much later, a few hundred years later, but there was some example of agricultural improvement at that time. And did she lend money to say early landowners at that time?
Well, she was involved in lending money to landowners, but whether it was for enclosures, I wouldn't know, I'm afraid. I never saw any record of that happening. But she did lend money to landowners and was involved in her own land, of course, for a while.
Okay.
Like you, I've not heard of enclosures until much later.
Thank you.
And I think Michael wanted to come back in as well, but I think we've lost him.
No, it's absolutely fine.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, who's got a hand up now? I can't see anyone.
Oh, I apologise, I couldn't find always relevant slides, but I thought slides I got were pretty and were nice.
They were.
They give you the atmosphere of the period.
Oh, Janet Bray in the chat says, asks, was she religious?
Wouldn't have the foggiest idea, but I suspect she went to shul every week and kept kashrut because everybody would have done. But whether she was religious inside her soul, that's an interesting question. But she would have kept all the laws because that's what you did in the medieval period.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Jackie, for joining us this evening. That was fascinating. It was, I loved it. It was brilliant. There were so many parts in it that I recognised from history, but didn't know there were Jewish elements or Jewish aspects to them. So thank you for giving us that fresh take and giving us another forgotten voice that is no longer forgotten because we're here remembering them.
And there should be that statue. If it's not there yet, Gail says she doesn't think it's there yet. I thought it was there by now, but I know that it's going to be there if it's not there yet, very soon.